back to another edition of Relatable. I'm your host, Stephanie Michelle. This is the show where we talk about exceptional human encounters, the people who make them happen, and the actions it takes to create them. Now, this is the last episode of Relatable for 2019. And as I reflect on this journey, it's honestly been one of the most important journeys of my life. I've learned how to be a better listener. I have been so incredibly inspired. I've celebrated and been energized through the strength of vulnerability that comes through my guests and ripples out to you, creating more connection and opportunity for us to see how important it is to feel this shared spirit that flows through all of us. The same collective spirit that's required to heal. We are not well as a society, a nation, or a species until all have the same healing available to all of us. As we end this Relatable Season 3, here's my hope, that each of you know that your story and experiences matter. Don't let anyone tell you that what you feel or see is not important. Stay curious about yourself and others. Don't let fear prevent you from pursuing love of any kind. Keep going, nourish the connections that matter to you, and let your passions be a form of self-care and the way that you participate in the world to change its course from destructive fear-based action to actions of love. Love for our planet and for all the people that live here, and all the animals too. Let's correct and create new stories together. As we end this season, I'm thrilled to have in the studio with me a man that's pursuing the details of his own story with the understanding of how to help others like him discover their story as well. Joining us in the studio today is Terrence M. Franklin. He's a seasoned attorney handling trust and estate litigation matters as a partner in the law firm of Sacks Glazier Franklin Lodise and Lodise. Terry recently discovered that his fourth great-grandfather, John, owned his fourth great-grandmother, Lucy. But John set Lucy free with their children and grandchildren in a will from 1846. That Terry's uncle then challenged in court. Those discoveries helped Terry understand that he had a mission to help bend the arc of history towards justice by sharing the story of his family's escape from slavery and other stories like it. In addition to being an active member of the trust and estate community in Los Angeles and nationally, Terry is a graduate of Northwestern University and Harvard Law School. He's also a creative artist, a writer, a storyteller, and a performer.
Thank you.
Welcome.
It's a delight to be here.
Yes.
I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. Not ending the season, but like going out on a bang,
Right. Well, thank you.
Yeah, I know some of your details of your story, but I can't wait to hear more. So, Terry, is there anything pulling your attention right now that you just want to put out there before we get into your story?
Well, I just came from court. I had a court hearing this morning, and I've got more law to do this afternoon. So now I'm just trying to be focused on being right here in the moment with you.
Perfect.
So let's do that.
Let's do that. All right. Well, so let's start in the beginning. Like, can you tell me anything about your childhood that kind of connects you to the man that you are today? Maybe.
Ooh, interesting. I grew up in Chicago.
Okay.
Had an older brother and parents who were very loving, and I never doubted that they, supported and loved and cared for me throughout my life. But I also knew that I had inklings that maybe I was gay. I knew that I was, but I knew that it didn't fit with what we were supposed to be because we were a Christian family on the south side of Chicago, Midwest, in the I'm 56, so there really were no role models. There were no highly successful gay black men who were out there that I could look to as role models. So I had to figure out how to deal with that. So instead, I sort of focused myself on trying to focus on how I could succeed. I wanted to become a lawyer. I sort of modeled myself, or at least thought of myself as looking at Thurgood Marshall or Dr. Martin Luther King as these examples of people who really achieved and who worked hard to do something. And even though I had artistic inclinations as I was younger too, I would do, theater, write poetry, things like that. But I sort of had a feeling like if I shared too much of that somebody might realize that it might be a tell for the fact that I'm gay.
Yeah.
So I kind of avoided that, sort of put that to the back, but would sneak out every once in a while. And went to high school in Chicago and sort of focused on education and moving forward. One of the people I went to high school with was actually Michelle Obama. We had French class together, and I kept going through high school, then college, and spent my junior year abroad in France, and that was sort of an enlightening period for me because I was sort of able to experiment and try thinking of myself as a gay person while I was there.
That culture was definitely more open to...
It was more open, I think, to the idea of, foreigners or expats, they kind of have a sort of mystique of their own. And so I was able to sort of assume that personality and be somebody who was a little bit different in that year. When I came home, there was an incident where my brother, I think, became aware of the fact that he found a letter that suggested that I was probably gay. My parents confronted me. I had to deal with that. And in the end, what I ended up doing was sort of saying, well, I think I'm bisexual. And sort of found myself on a path of trying to find relationships with men, with women, trying back and forth to try to understand. And it was about that time in '86 that I went to law school. And at the very beginning of law school, the first icebreaker question at the Black Law Students Association gathering was, "What's your birthday?" And there was an attractive African-American woman who happened to have the same birthday I did. And we fell in love. We were married for many years and raised children together. And it wasn't until 2010 that really this urge that I think I'd sort of been repressing and trying to put aside really came out. And by 46, I had to live who I was. And my wife and I ended up splitting up. But we have a friendship now that I think is good for both of us and for our children, and we work together in raising our children. And after we split up, I ended up really being able to really become who I am, understand myself better, understand different aspects of my personality. I've returned in a way to some of the artistic things that I hadn't done before that I put aside because I thought they would be tells of who I was. And it was also during that time that I began to consider things that were sort of arts or writing related, and that sort of led me to the path that got me to this discovery of my family history that I really didn't know was there.
I feel like hearing this beginning part of your story, that you pursuing the wholeness of who you are opened that door to go, how much more can I be whole? Like how far can I go back to really know?
I think there is that, and I think there's also sort of a parallel that I'll probably talk about a little bit later about the relationship that existed between my fourth great grandfather John and Lucy, my fourth great grandmother. That was, I don't know what the relationship truly was. Obviously, he owned her, and by our standards and by any definition, there's no consent in that relationship. So any relationship, any sexual relationship is rape as far as we understand it. But I think that people try to find ways within the circumstances that they're in to make do and to make the best of circumstances. And frankly, I think that's what happened with my ancestors, and that I think they had some kind of a relationship that ended up being positive in some way. And at least John saw to it that the family, that Lucy and her 8 children and her 6 grandchildren were all emancipated after he died. And so in that, there is some value in the fact that, at least I choose to believe that Lucy had some agency, that maybe she encouraged John to make sure that they would be emancipated once he was dead. And so I see a parallel between that relationship that was in a structure that was constricting with myself, and as much as I loved my wife and loved my children and so much of the aspects of our lives together, there was a constriction that I, put on myself that I'd allowed myself to live with for, most of my life. And like my ancestors, at some point, you have to move through that, and you try to make the best of the circumstances that you can. And since I've become able to appreciate myself and to understand myself better, and I've met my now husband, we've been married a year now, who's also helped me to open up and express myself artistically and thought-wise. It's given me a greater perspective on who I am as a human being.
Do you remember your first thought in terms of you were going to dig into finding out more about your family and your ancestors? Like, how did that start? And what's the first thing that you did to try to find information?
All right. So in 2001, we had a family reunion in Chicago. Our family has them every couple of years. They sort of rotate from city to city, and like a lot of African American families who are trying to find ways to reconnect with one another and to stay bonded, despite slavery and Jim Crow and all of that, the Great Migration, we would have these family reunions. And I went to one in 2001, and part of the reunion materials included a little excerpt that someone had typed up of a will that they had located in southern Illinois. I think it was probably a cousin of my mother's who passed away sometime in the 80s or 90s, and she typed it up on IBM Selectric with a cursive font, because obviously she was trying to create the sense that there was something written. The young people were like, what's a cursive font? But you used to have these little balls that you put on a computer, that you put on a typewriter to try to create different fonts. And this excerpt said that I, John Sutton, being of sound mind but infirm in body, hereby proclaim that I own the following property. To wit, a mulatto slave, Lucy, aged about 45, and her daughter Easter, aged about 27, and listing all of these 8 children and then all of Easter's 6 children, down to the little toddler Mahala, who was 14 months old when the will was done in January of 1846. And so this relative had included, in the family reunion materials, this excerpt. And I saw it and I thought that was interesting, and what they cared most about was the names and the ages, because that would be the lines that they could try to direct to connect. But when I saw it, I was kind of like, but what was going on with John and Lucy? Was there something there? It was curious to me. But I kind of, after we came back from the family reunion, I went back to my practice of law. I do trust and estates litigation, which seems ironic, but now I believe that was part of the reason why I found my way to this practice of law. It was somewhat random. I worked with somebody who did trust and estates litigation. They said, if you ever want to do something like this, let me know. I joined that kind of practice in 1992 and had been doing it for a while, for 20 years before I realized this was going on. So we had this reunion in 2001. I thought these materials were interesting. I actually, because it listed the book and the page number where the original document was recorded in Jacksonville, Florida, and where a copy was also recorded in in Georgia, where John had lived before. And
a little tickle. I don't know where it's coming from. Sorry.
These things happen.
I know. All right. I think I got it.
So in 2001, I called the clerk in Duval County and I said, I'm trying to find this will. I have the book number and the page number. Can you help me find it? And I think a clerk must have said, yes, please send $2 for the cost of the copy. And so I dutifully sent a letter and mailed it off and promptly forgot about it. I didn't think about it. It sort of slipped my mind until 2014.
So nothing came?
Nothing came. They forgot. I forgot. And then come 2014, I had a great aunt who was turning 100. And this great aunt was very special to everybody in the family. Her name was Viola. And she was born in 1914, an African-American woman. Unlike a lot of African-American people at that time, I think, she actually went to college. She walked, I think they say, 4 miles each way to Southern Illinois University, which is where she lived, and got her degree. And she married a man named William Harold Walker, who actually was a Tuskegee Airman. She traveled with him to Tuskegee and helped teach the children of other Tuskegee Airmen before they shipped off. And they came back, they worked in Sunday school together. He was a principal, she was a teacher, and they adopted a child, but they didn't have any natural children of their own. But she was a real matriarch in our family. And so she was the last surviving member of that generation. And as she was turning 100 in 2014, I wanted to do something special to recognize her presence and what she meant to all of us. And I was trying to think what I could do that would be special. And I remembered that will, that little excerpt of that will from 2001, and I didn't remember that I'd sent for it, but I knew that I had those reunion materials somewhere, so I tearing up the house and trying to figure out where those materials are, and I finally found it, and I pulled it out, and I thought, well, I have the page and line number, I'm going to find this document, and by then, I was a fellow in the American College of Trust and Estate Counsel, which is a national organization of trust and estates lawyers who have spent a lot of time in practice, who regularly speak or talk about trust and estates issues. And what that gave me was a directory of lawyers from across the country that I could reach out to and ideally be able to ask them if they could help me with a problem like this. I pulled that directory off the shelf. This is the week before I'm going back to Southern Illinois for my great aunt's birthday. And I opened up the directory, I looked for a couple of lawyers who seemed to be about my age, and I left messages for two of them. And one lawyer called me back and she said, you know, left me a message. There was a fire in 1901, the Great Fire of Jacksonville, destroyed all the records. You're probably not going to find anything. I'm like, what? But I got a call back a little bit later from a paralegal at another law firm. And she said, you know, I work with a lawyer who asked me to check on this for you, and I told her that I was looking for this for my great aunt's birthday, and I wanted to celebrate that. And I think she sort of got into the story and was intrigued by it. And I said, I know there was the fire in 1901, so I'm probably not going to find anything. And she
But
said,
gotta try.
but you know, gotta try. And she said, well, let me see what I can do.
Yeah.
So by the end of that day, I had an email from her that said, her name was Ann Tatum. She said, we found a John Sutton file. We don't know if it's the right one, but we should have it by Friday. Remind you, this is the week before I'm going to go back for my great aunt's 100th birthday. That Friday morning, I go into the office, I turn on my computer. We found it, we've got it, this is the right John Sutton file, right? So she says, what do you want me to do? So I call her up and I say, you know, take a picture. So she gets her attorney service to go and take a picture of this 2-page document, and the first images I see are of this red wax seal, which, you know, before the days of lick 'em, stick 'em envelopes, they would just take a piece of paper and fold it over and seal it with wax.
Me. They look so cool looking.
Always fascinated me.
Right.
And you know, I'll digress for a moment, because even when I was a kid, I was into calligraphy, and I asked my dad at one point, we were in a store, Cox and Brentano's in Chicago. They had this little set of wax seals, and I was like, wow, I would, you know, can I have one of those? And my dad's like, what do you need that for? And I said, I don't know, I just want one.
They're
and
cool.
I wish there was a red one. There was not a red one, but I got one that was sort of a pink color. So I would like seal cards and things like that with it. So for me to then see these years later, this first image on this red wax seal, and it makes me think something in my DNA was calling out to me to say, you got to find this thing.
Yeah.
So, you know, I see this image, red wax seal, 2-page will, and I'm just blown away because now we have the full language of the will that describes the fact that John had lived in Georgia before, but then moved to Florida. And I thought, well, this really sort of tells something more of a story. It doesn't necessarily explain what their relationship was like, but the fact that he saw to it that they were freed, and he named an executor, somebody who would be responsible for making sure that they got to freedom somewhere. And as the document was written, it actually included provisions that said that if for some reason the will was challenged or a court found that it was invalid, that this man who John had chosen as his executor, William Adams, was to own the family outright, because John trusted that this person would see to it that they would make it their way to freedom. So all of this suggested to me that there was something more to this story, that there was that there was love or something that existed between John and Lucy. So I took my images to the family reunion. We shared it with the family. We were all fascinated by it, and this has been a process of us all learning this thing together. My great aunt, who was very busy with things, found it interesting too. But I came back to LA, and I kept thinking about it and thinking about this John and Lucy and what relationship, was there something? And I wrote an article. It was called, I forgot what it was called, but it was for the Probate and Property magazine. And what I suggested was that maybe there was something like love that could have existed even through the bonds of slavery, that water, that love like water finds its path, and at some point that was perhaps what existed between John and Lucy, or at least something that caused him to make sure that they would be okay.
How did people respond to that?
Well,
I'm almost afraid to ask.
I know. Surprisingly, I didn't get much pushback.
Good.
But I got an email from a professor at Suffolk University, African-American professor, and she told me that she'd written a book called Fathers of Conscience, Mixed Race Inheritance in the Antebellum South. And Tracing the Path of Love, I think was the name of my article. But she said she'd written this book, and she had traced all these cases from pre-Civil War era in which white men had left either gifts of property or emancipation to slaves. And after the men died, the families would often challenge the wills and would say that the old man lacked capacity, he didn't know what he was doing, he was unduly influenced, that is, he was encouraged to do this by people who had, evil intent. And that, so sometimes the wills would be upheld by the courts, sometimes they'd be overturned. Sometimes the Court of Appeals, when the decisions were reviewed, would say, yes, this is what he wanted, but the public policy of the state of Mississippi doesn't allow for free Negroes. So we're not going to give effect to this will, and instead these people go back into slavery. So
in your case, so there was an uncle that?
So at that point, I was like, wow, this is fascinating. I didn't know anything about an uncle in my family's case, but I thought the story of my ancestors and the nuance of the possibility of what their relationship might have been like was something that other people should hear. That maybe our sense of black and white and race in this country needs to have more of a finer appreciation for the details of it.
What's coming up for me as you're sharing this is, so I know that there's two things that really bind us, right? Conversation like this and experiences, like going through mutual experiences. So in hearing your story, I'm hoping that as these two people lived together, even, they lived on the same homestead, right? That as they experienced each other, you can imagine a love growing or to be influenced by each other and to understand, deep in your root that it's not right to own a person, that
there's something wrong. At least, these are at that point, we didn't know whether they were family members, whether John was related to them. As far as we know, the will says, my mulatto slave Lucy and her children and her grandchildren. Like, there was no acknowledgement that these were his family. But, we know from history that that's likely to be true. But we also know that they didn't seem to have been sold off, but they all seem to be intact there together. And so I started thinking, how can I share this story and get other people interested in the possibilities of what relationships can be and what they are? And so I started outlining a novel. And I decided, I'll tell the story of my ancestors, but I'll make it more interesting. And you should write what you know. I was a trust and estates litigator for 20 years. I'd done will contests up and down. And so I thought, let's throw in a will contest, because that'll make it more interesting. And I'll make up a brother for John. And I'll call him Eustace, because that seems like a good old-timey name. So I started outlining this novel, and around the same time, I had met the person who's now my husband, Jeffrey, who was my fiance, or at the time we were just dating. He had been a Buddhist for 20 plus years when I met him. And so he would chant twice a day, Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, and this was, it was a dedication to the mystic law of cause and effect. And so in the morning and the evening he would chant, and I would sometimes join him, sometimes not. It wasn't, I grew up Christian, and so this was all kind of foreign to me. But one day he was chanting, and I felt inspired to chant with him. And I know that there's a part of the Lotus Sutra, which is what you're chanting from, when you chant for enlightenment from your ancestors back 7+ generations and 7+ generations forward. And that day while we were chanting, as we were going through that part of the prayer, I felt like John and Lucy were in the room with me. Like, they were physically, it felt like they were physically there with me, and that they were telling me that there was more to this story. And, when we finished chanting, I told Jeffrey, I was like, I feel like John and Lucy were here. And he's like, that's the mystic law. He's like used to it. So I felt like I was on this path, and I would wake up in the middle of the night. I'd wake up talking, and he would say, "Who are you talking to?" And I'd say, "I don't know. Maybe it was John or Lucy."
Yeah.
So I'm outlining this novel and trying to come up with this story and trying to understand it. And about 6 months later, I was going to be at a conference in Florida, of the American College of Trust and State Counsel, ACTEC, that same organization that I talked about before. And I told Jeffrey, while we're there, let's go see the will. And while we're there, let's videotape it. I think it could possibly be something important and meaningful. And he was down for it. He had done some short films before and was an artist himself. And so we went to this meeting in Florida, down in Marco Island, which is down at the southwest tip. I hadn't thought about the fact that Duval County Jacksonville's like way at the other corner, so I should have made arrangements to fly, but I didn't.
You drove Florida? Oh my God!
5.5 hours.
My parents live there.
Oh, do they?
Yeah,
So you know what I'm talking about.
But you drove Florida.
It's a long ass stay.
It is a long ass stay.
But because I knew we were going to have this long drive, I kind of wanted to infuse it with something that made it more important. So it was around that time that the Equal Justice Initiative, that's run by Brian Stevenson, a civil rights lawyer, who also went to Harvard Law School, and who was a few years ahead of me, but I was familiar with his work, helping death row inmates avoid death. But at that time, they were working on a project to try to create monuments for lynchings. They had managed to document some 4,000 lynchings that had taken place between the end of the Civil War and the Civil Rights era. And they had an appendix that you could look at online that identified by county where all of these things happen. And I told Jeffrey, let's count the lynchings as we drive across the state of Florida and make note of them and try to learn something from them. And the morning as we were about to set out, I think it was March 5th, 2015, I'm in the shower. I think Jeffrey was outside chanting, and the water was coming down on my head, and I was trying to imagine what it would be like when I put my finger on that X that John Sutton had made in 1846 that set our family free. And I was like, am I going to break down? Is this going to be like an emotional experience? What's going to happen? And it's like what I kept seeing was this image from the movie Selma that was out then, and I don't know if you've seen it, but Ava DuVernay directed this film, and there's this one scene when Coretta Scott King is going to go visit with Malcolm X. Coretta's husband, Martin Luther King, is in jail at the time, and they're trying to try to make a connection between Martin Luther King's movement and Malcolm X's movement. Malcolm X had just left the Nation of Islam, and Coretta is talking to Amelia Boynton Robinson, and Amelia Boynton Robinson had been at the front lines of the civil rights movement. She'd been beaten and arrested and fought and everything, but Coretta, they'd sort of try to keep her away from it as protection for the family. So she was anxious, and Amelia Boynton Robinson sort of takes her arm, and these two elegant ladies are walking with their purses, and she says, "Do you want me to tell you what I think about at times like this that gives me comfort?" And she said, "We are descended from people who built civilization, people who crossed vast oceans in the hulls of slave ships, people who overcame terrors and tortures unimaginable, people who create and thrive and innovate and love, and their blood is running in you, it's pumping your heart right now, you are already prepared." I don't know why that was in my head, but that's what I kept feeling as the water was rushing over me, and I come out and I tell Jeffrey about it, and we get in the car, we turn on the radio, and the Justice Department is announcing that they've come up with their findings on what had happened in Ferguson with Michael Brown's killing, and so it just seemed like a weighted moment, it was weighted. So we start driving across the state, and we're counting the lynchings, and Jeffrey's reading about them and these terrible tragedies about men who came back from World War I who actually had the nerve to buy a car, and so people in the community thought, how dare you be so uppity as to own property? And so he's lynched. And you think about each one of those lynchings and what it represented for that individual and for that family and for that whole community, because it's terrorism. That's what it was intended to do. So, we were driving across the state, and 125 lynchings we noted in the process of going across the state. We made a donation to the a token donation of $125, the Equal Justice Initiative for that. But we finally landed and arrived in Duval County, Florida. Jacksonville, and here we are, these two gay guys. We have our little, jaunty fedoras. We're going to the courthouse, and we're gonna go in and see this will. And we go in, and as we're going in, somebody's like, "Yeah, that's the way you do it." And we were kind of like, "Well, what was that about?" We didn't know until later on that Duval County was actually one of the 2 counties in Florida that refused to issue any marriage licenses at all, rather than to issue them to same-sex couples. And this is just months before the big Obergefell decision came down that proclaimed marriage equality in the United States. So I think some people thought that we were coming in to try to, we were going to come in and challenge the system or something, but we weren't, not till last year. So we got through security, got down to the basement, and I'd called ahead and asked to have the will, this will set aside, the file. And the clerks are like, "Well, we don't see it. Where is it? I don't know. You have to come back tomorrow." We're like, "Oh no, 5.5 hours. We've driven across the state. We're gonna see this will today." And finally, they found it on a supervisor's desk, and they pull out this file. It's like the size of a lady's clutch purse. It's like a
so it's kind of rolled, like
it's like a fold-over file, much like a portfolio file in a brown color that you see, but it's got an elastic band on it. And I sit down, and Jeffrey's videotaping me. I take off the band, and I open it up, and I pull out this sheaf of papers. And the very first thing I see is that red wax seal on that envelope, just as I'd seen in the first email that I'd gotten the year before, and probably that my DNA was telling me that I needed to track down since I was a little kid. And I'm like, "Oh my God, here it is, right?" And I move that out of the way, and the first thing on top is the will. And this 2-page document is there, and I open it up and I look at it, and I looked at Jeff and I was like, "Wow!" And I put my finger on that X, and I'm ready for this rush of emotions that's going to overtake me, and I'm not feeling anything. And I'm going, "Why am I not feeling anything?" And then I start flipping through the other papers, because in my mind there was just this will. And the envelope, because that's all I'd asked her to do. And as it turns out, I remember now the paralegal said something like, "Well, what do you want me to do with the other stuff?" And I said, "That doesn't matter, just give me copies of the will." So I had focused on that, but suddenly I'm sitting here and I'm realizing there's a whole file. This is the will file of John Sutton. So I'm flipping through and I'm recognizing these documents that I'm prepared to understand, because I've been a trust and estates litigator for 25 years, and things haven't changed that much in how one practices law. And I see the citation to a peer, and I see the inventory of the assets of the estate, and there's 400 cows, and he didn't own any land, but I see 400 cows and a couple of horses and household goods, and down at the bottom it says, "We were supposed to inventory the following slaves: Lucy, her daughter Easter, Maria, Mahala, Sarah, Joel, Jack, all the way down to baby Mahala. But according to the will, they were supposed to be removed from the state, so we're not inventorying them." So that's consistent with what I thought. And I'm flipping through, and I get to this one document that looks like it says petition. And I start reading it, and I'm like, "Oh my God. There really was a contest."
Oh my God.
What I had believed in my dreams and my DNA, what I was writing in this novel, this contest that I had made up really did happen. And instead of this Uncle Eustace that I'd made up with a good old-timey name, was Shadrach. Shadrach Sutton. It was even more old-timey than I could have imagined. And Shadrach had actually filed a petition challenging the will, saying that John didn't have the capacity, that he was old, that he was wandering in his intellect, that he was an old man, that these designs of these persons on him had tried to take advantage of him, that they had
implying your grandma,
that Lucy had unduly influenced him, and that he'd been plied with ardent spirits. They'd given him alcohol to convince him to do this will, right? And because of that, the will is invalid according to Shadrach's petition. I'm like, wow, this is amazing. This is the story that I guess I've been living in my DNA that I didn't know was true. I flipped more. And I realized that part of what I have in this file is the transcript of the trial. And the transcript is the judge's handwritten notes. And the judge's name was William F. Crabtree. Couldn't have made that up either, you know. That's perfect for the novel.
Yeah.
So William F. Crabtree transcribes the notes, and so he transcribes the notes that say that Gregory Yale, who was the lawyer who drafted the will, testified that he went to John's house. The family greeted him, not the slaves. The family greeted him. They offered him dinner. They'd had an appointment to come into town, but John had been too sick to make it into town for the appointment. Gregory Yale explained that John had wanted, he'd moved to Florida because he thought he could set the family free there. In Georgia, they couldn't. The rules were much more draconian there, and they believed that Florida would be more amenable because it had a long history of a Spanish tradition, which was more accepting of mixed races, and there were many mixed race families actually living in the area that my family ended up in. That's why they went there. They'd heard about it. And so Gregory Yale said that the reason why John had moved there was he thought he could emancipate them there, but it was only when he got there he found out that there was a law that prohibited it. So there was a statute that said he couldn't just emancipate them. In fact, the statute said that if you were going to emancipate someone in Florida, you had to pay a $200 fee, you had to post a bond for the value of each one of the slaves for the 30 days that they could remain in the state, but they had to get out within 30 days because there was sort of a tipping point of black to white in Florida, and they didn't want any more free black people walking around in Florida. So they're like, no more. So instead, John had to do this will. And then the will went on to say that he was naming William Adams as his executor to make sure that the family would make it to freedom. I found out later on that William is probably Lucy's half-brother, that Lucy and William had basically grown up together, and that when William's father had died, William was too young to inherit property. And so John became the guardian for William, and so anything William owned, John owned, and that included Lucy. The notes also indicated in Gregory Yale's testimony that at one point, Lucy came into the room, and Gregory Yale asked her, you know, what would you like to do? And she said, I'd just as soon stay here, but Shadrach has always threatened that he would beat us if he ever came to own us. So I need to get out of here. She didn't want to go to a cold place. She didn't want to, you know, but she understood that in order to preserve and protect and to save her family, that she had to go. And so we have these words of Lucy that come through the lawyer's testimony that's then handwritten by this judge in this transcript that I'm now reading in 2015 that, you know, brings me into their world and brings them into my world, and we're suddenly connected, you know, this relationship. And it was just mind-blowing that, you know, that this all unfolded and that this is so much deeper than the typical stories that we hear of black and white and you're slave or you're free. I mean, the nature of freedom and its transitory nature, you know. Yes, they were slaves at that moment, and then they had to make their way from Jacksonville, Florida. The story is they got on boats, went down through New Orleans, up the Mississippi to Illinois, where they claimed their freedom. And it was after that that Shadrach actually challenged the will. Fortunately, they were already there.
Yeah.
And as I continued to dig through the file, as we sat there in the file room in Duval County, I got to the bottom of the file, and there was the final decree, entered on March 10th, 1847, that upheld the will and found that Shadrach's contest was invalid and ordered Shadrach to pay $28.08 in costs. So, vindication. It was like, you know, this revelation of history and my connection to it. And so, you know, that was just like an incredible experience. We drove back 5.5 hours, talked to the other lawyers who were there. Some of our Florida lawyer friends said, oh my God, you got to get those records. I'm like, what do you mean we got to get those records? They said there's a new statute in Florida that says that any records can be destroyed once they've been digitized. Ugh. So I'm like, I don't know how to do that. They went into court pro bono for me. They talked to the judge in Duval County, and as it turns out, the judge who was making this decision was a descendant of Isaiah Hart, who was one of the original founders of the city of Jacksonville. And he said that he recalled a story about a clerk who supposedly took some files, put them on a boat, went into the St. Johns River, and saved them from the Great Fire of Jacksonville in 1901. So in my mind, these documents, which I now own, were saved because they needed to get to me.
Yeah.
A whole set of circumstances that had to happen in order for these documents to end up in my hands, where I can then share them with you, and people out there, and share them with the world, because I think they tell us something about humanity, and about the value of human life. And as I travel around the country, so I do tell this story mostly to lawyers, but I also tell it to other groups, Black History presentations. And I've also written a number of articles, and I'm working on a screenplay for a limited series about the family's escape from slavery. But when I tell the story, I say that I used to think history was what happened to famous people like kings and queens, or princes and popes, or to ordinary people who did something extraordinary, like Harriet Tubman, or John Brown, or Martin Luther King even. But what I realized through this process of unpacking this story is that we're living history every day. My ancestors who did what they could to try to make life better for themselves and for me ultimately, are on the same arc of history with me, and my descendants out there, 7 generations yet unborn. And I think the question for each of us is, what are we doing on a day-to-day basis to make sure that we're trying to bend that arc of history towards justice? So that's what I'm trying to do in sharing the story, and in trying to share it as widely as I can in all the forums that I possibly can, is to try to bend the arc of history towards justice. I've determined that's my mission, my personal mission in life.
It's so beautiful, and I'm sure, like, part of your story, when people hear it, and maybe they've tried to go on the same path, and they didn't know how to find these documents, because it's not. I think people may take this for granted, like that you can get on Ancestry.com and just find your stuff.
Right.
But in the case of slavery, a lot of maybe they weren't like John, and people destroyed these things because they didn't think it was important.
There's a lot that's just gone. It's lost to history, to the ash bins of history. But yes, people come up to me a lot of times and they go, "Oh, I wish I had that kind of stuff in my life, in my history." And I say 2 things. One, it's surprising how many things can be found. The technology has improved so much. The resource archives, we can get stuff through, the Mormon Church actually has a bunch of stuff that's very deep and extensive. And you can almost sit on your couch. I can sit on my couch and read the Jacksonville News from 1846, if I get to the right website, and you may end up finding something. But I say to even people who can't find their own, my story is America's story. This is all of our stories. This is about what we all did, about what our country did. And so if you can't find your own story, share mine with me, and come with me on this journey, to explore this mission of how we can all try to do better, how we can all try to bend that arc of history towards justice. So it's been this magical process of unfolding and sharing this story, and then other things have popped up that have told me that I'm on the right path. So
you're still looking for information?
Still looking for information, still uncovering things, like uncovering the extensive nature of the mixed race families that lived in that area. It was quite a haven for people who were coming there. There were other stories. The first woman executed in the state of Florida was actually a former slave. Her family had also come from Georgia to Florida. He'd emancipated them there, but this was a horrible man who raped his daughters, and eventually one of his daughters took a drawing knife and hacked him in the head, killing him. And she was executed, becoming the first woman executed in the state of Florida. And then what would happen to her children? They ended up back in slavery. So all of that was part of the stories that I've been investigating. But another interesting story that people don't know is that one of the wealthiest families in Florida at that time were the Kingsleys. And Anna Majajini Jai Kingsley had been this 13-year-old stolen from Africa. The man who was the ship owner and the plantation owner, Zephaniah Kingsley, fell in love with this 13-year-old girl, married her in some kind of a ceremony in Haiti, in Cuba actually. But that was the ages when women would get married, when girls would get married at the time. But he put her in charge of his plantations and treated her as a wife. And in the end, he left property to her. And after he died, even though she was living in Haiti, where he had sent her to be protected from the increasing racism in Florida, she went there with their sons, and they married their daughters to white men in Florida. After he died, she had to come back to the United States to fight to receive the property that she was entitled to, and she had to trace back their arrival in Spanish Florida to the time when the treaty that was first done between John Adams as the Secretary of State and Onís, who was the Spanish ambassador, that brought Florida into the States, and to say, we were Spanish citizens, we have the rights of Spanish citizens, and even though there's laws now that say I can't inherit this because I'm black, those laws preserve my rights to inherit. And she did inherit that property. And so all of these stories are part of our history too. And so my husband Jeffrey and I have been unpacking these stories, and so we have a view for trying to create almost like a podcast or a documentary program where we sort of follow the family's path and along the way unpack these stories that tell us something about what our history was and about where we can be, how we can relate to those experiences and then try to do something that moves us forward. And then I was invited to become a history maker. There's an organization called the History Makers, founded by a woman named Juliana Richardson, who also happens to be a Harvard alum. And she talks to African Americans and collects their stories, and it's the world's largest African American video oral history project. And they record your video. When I first saw the email, I said, oh, it's just 3 to 4 minutes, fine. I called back and said, oh yeah, I'm happy to do that. They said, no, it's 3 to 4 hours. So
you could do it.
I can do that. So I go and I sit for 3 to 4 hours and I talk about my story and my understanding of this history and this past. And I just got a notification last week that it's officially now been installed as one of these videos in the archives at the Library of Congress. And so part of this mission that I have of making sure that my descendants yet unborn, 7 generations beyond, it's there.
Yeah.
This story is there for them, and it connects them to me to John and Lucy, and it's there for everybody to see. And so that's a big part of what inspires me and tells me that I'm on the right path, that I'm doing the right things, that sharing this story is vital and important.
Yeah. It seems so timely right now to know, when I think about what I was taught in school about history, about the history of our country, and to leave these stories out of that, just to say, oh, well, there were people that were for slavery and against, and they fought about, that's not the story. The story that I'm hearing today is there's always people for humanity. There's always people that protect relationship, that that do believe in the goodness of each other and the lives and the heritage, and we need to hear that more. So whatever you do, you got to keep me in touch.
We need to hear that more, and we need to point out that there have been creations or recreations of history that have deluded us from what really happened. We've gone places where we see, this beautiful monument to this great tree that was the meeting up tree in Florida. Jeffrey and I were in Florida, and outside the courthouse of justice, and the plaques, which was placed by I think the Daughters of the Confederacy. This was the meeting up tree. The true story is it was a lynching tree. This was a tree that was used to lynch people. You had to walk under the lynching tree to get to justice. And yet, they placed a plaque over it that claims that it has a whole different purpose. And, as we stood there, and Jeffrey could feel the pain of the tree that had to witness, these lynchings that took place. And I was imagining, a little white girl there with her family and the whole community cheering on this experience of inhumanity. And I'm wondering how that scarred, a little white girl who's wondering, why is this happening? Why, what is this barbarism that I'm a part of? And so, sharing this story is, I think, to try to, as Buddhists, change that karma, to turn it around, to recognize that there were causes made that have these horrible effects, but it's up to us, in our day-to-day lives, to unpack those stories and to share them with people. That's the relationship. Brian Stevenson says, what binds us together is our brokenness. And that's where our humanity is, and that part of what's important for us is to be out in the world with other human beings, relating to one another, and not just on our cell phones and in our computers, because it's really in this interhuman, one-on-one contact, or even in larger groups, that we really get to the core of understanding who we are as human beings.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I think it's been said on this show, and I don't remember who said it, but that you, Dee, sitting behind the camera, we didn't break this world, but the brokenness that we have in it is what will heal it. If we acknowledge that, put these pieces together, like, we need people to rise up and use their brokenness to help heal some of these things. So couldn't encourage that more. We have a couple more things that we get to do.
Yes.
We are running out of
do
time. But you've got to stay in touch with us.
Yes, absolutely.
Stay
I'll
in
keep
touch
you
with
posted.
us. I want to hear about how the evolution of these projects, podcasts, film, whatever you do. This is just amazing, and the new stuff that I'm sure you're going to keep exploring and sharing. But I think this is the most appropriate time to ask this question after what you shared. So every guest that sits here, I ask this question: what does this phrase "exceptional human encounter" mean to you? And
I think exceptional human encounter can be every human encounter. I mean, there's opportunities every day. There's somebody that you're going to meet that you don't know what you can do for them that they can do for you, and it's not a transactional thing, but I think it's like being open to the fact that we have this shared humanity. And so for me, exceptional human encounters are the things that we have every day, the people that we deal with all the time, that help us to move ourselves forward, and with my mission in mind, move ourselves forward to help to bend that arc of history towards justice.
Absolutely. So we were both raised Christian in the Midwest, and I don't necessarily consider myself Christian either. I think that my relationship with Spirit and God has evolved, but there's one quote in the Bible that always has been my favorite, which is, "When two or more gather in my name, I am there." And I take that as, and I've said it before on the show, that there is opportunity when two people gather in the name of love, because I believe that God is love, and just love in their heart, not necessarily, it doesn't have to be for each other, but just love, the presence of love, that there is opportunity for something beautiful, spirit, to evolve between them. And it has nothing to do with either person. It's just like that connection, that thread between us that we all have. Like, it will surprise you. Sometimes it's called grace, like that it's always there and available to you, and it has nothing to do with your spiritual beliefs. It's just that we do have connection between us, and whatever spark that creates that extra little something to happen, that is exceptional.
Absolutely.
And could be just a look, a story, whatever the case may be. But it's life affirming and energetic when you experience it, and I just wish everybody has a chance to experience that and then pursue it.
Right.
And I hope that what I've done with this show is to show that that's available to all of us.
Yeah, when you're conscious of it, then you can look for it.
Absolutely. So the last thing that we get to do together in our time here is, so I also am a big advocate of learning, as you are, of just creating, just having a relationship with curiosity, and I think at this day and age that the learning, relational learning is really important. So as we go to the gym and we accept that we work out our physical body to have like a different experience, I think having a set practice of like doing this, it could be just a conversation, or trying a different conversation on, or practicing new tools for managing difficult conversations, like whatever we can do to be in better relationships with each other, especially in the juxtaposition of a lot of AI coming our way. I think it's really important. So the way that I do that here is to issue a social challenge of the week. They're little things that are just meant to say, hey, this is not the experience I'm going to dictate that you have, but just you're going to have a new experience if you try it. Maybe try it with a buddy, but just be open to those experiences.
Okay.
So I wrote down, I think, for our show, obviously something about taking the time to explore an ancestor in your life. But and of course there's tools out there, but I think if you still have opportunity to sit with a grandparent, an elder in your family, to ask them questions about people that they've heard about in their family, and even go so far as to say, or tell me about a story that you see in me, maybe this person, you knew certain characteristics about this person, and when you sit with me, your grandchild, like you see it in me, like ask that question. So what do you think about that? What could we add to that?
Yeah, I think that's brilliant, asking the people who were there.
Yeah.
But I mean in terms of that particular idea or other ideas to challenge?
If you have another one that kind of comes up.
Just the same one. That's part of my goal is, how do you as an individual, how can you think about trying to make the world a little bit better every day, in your interactions with other people? Is there an opportunity for kindness? You can make a choice. Kindness is a choice. And so often people do things that are cruel, and you kind of go, wow. Could you have done that kindly instead of the way that you chose to? Or can you create value in your day-to-day existence? How can we try and do that?
I think there's something, especially after what Terry just shared, when you start to listen to the history of your past and you hear about the characteristics that the people had in your life and you connect it to your own story, just by nature, I think you get a little extra energy to pursue kindness, to pursue love, to pursue making a difference when you realize your arc is not alone, like that you're on it with other people journeying somewhere, and take all of that, carry all of that with you to go and pursue what it is that you're doing. And I think kindness kind of has to be revealed in that process when you do that.
It's a collective effort,
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, so that's the social challenge, and this is really, I don't have any living grandparents at this point. Do you have living grandparents?
All of my grandparents have passed away.
Yeah, so, take it from two people that don't have them. Don't take that for granted. Do not, miss an opportunity to spend time. We're right up against the holidays. This is why I'm breaking. If you have the means to go see an elder in your family, go do it. Go do it. It will make their day.
Get their story.
Yeah, get their story and connect it to yours, and let that be the fuel that allows you to go do what you do and pursue the things that are going to make a difference in this world. So Terry and I encourage that, and you've seen his Instagram handle on the screen. We'll be sharing all your social media and some other podcasts that Terry has been a part of. So if you take the challenge, we'd love to hear from you, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I love it when I hear these stories about people who've gone out and found their own personal family stories and come back and tell me about it.
I bet. All right. Well, so that brings us to not only the end of this episode, but the end of the season. I'm really, really glad.
Thank
I knew
you.
like we have a mutual friend, Cleo, that's been he was season 2 on the show, that connected us. And when I heard your voice and didn't hear all of this, I just heard pieces of this. I was like, that's a good way to close the season down, and you did it well, my friend.
Thank you. It's an honor, and really a delight to be able to be here with you and to share this story. That's my mission, is to share this story. So thank you for helping me to fulfill my mission.
I'm thrilled that I was here to be able to do that with
you.
Thank you. So you guys know what I'm going to say, and you got to keep this in your heart for a while, because I don't know when we'll start the next season yet. But the opportunity, Terry expressed it, I've expressed it through the seasons. The opportunity for an exceptional encounter is in every moment of your day, and you're sharing moments of the day that all of us kind of take for granted. That elevator ride, that walking to the same location every day to your office. Smile, greet people like they are part of your family. I mean, you have the power. All of us have the power to create an exceptional encounter, and it's something that you can do that comes back to you. It's so energy given when you have these experiences with somebody that you're like, man, I feel you.
Right.
I really feel you,
It's huge.
Yes. So That's my sign off for the year. Please remember to do everything that you can to have an exceptional encounter every day, every moment of the day, and we'll see you in 2020.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.